Hare Om Namaha. Embedded in most statements from so-called ISKCON is propaganda loaded with diversions, euphemisms, and cognitive dissonance. When understood rightly, those public statements reveal the fraudulent nature of what the cult represents. Its assertions tend to be inherently deceitful, obscuring reality with a capital R. They are meant to override any person's rational faculties, hampering his or her higher intelligence, pragya. Deceit is also embedded in the cult's arguments. So-called ISKCON is an upasampradaya, one that has ceased to provide any genuine justification for its ongoing charade. Its claims of justification are all ultimately empty gestures. In effect, so-called ISKCON has become a kind of warped parody of itself. No serious transcendentalist believes in either its pretexts or its pantomime. Its institutional gurus are subservient to the vitiated GBC, and the vibration from their presence in the world, what to speak of their imitation initiation ceremonies, are, in the final analysis, spiritually illegal. So-called ISKCON and the vitiated GBC, its power node, represent a spiritually lawless entity, a wild card. Both violate the source code of their articles of incorporation and their charter, including the Commission's own direction of management. So-called ISKCON is a dangerous form of an oligarchy, but it effectively promotes irrational thrills in those unlucky enough to place their faith in it. The presentations its representatives make, especially when speaking to justify their institution's actions, are often chock full of historical revisionism. As far as revenge for personal affronts, thwarted ambition, and/or attempts to aggrandize partisan followers is concerned, some or all of those can be motivating principles for such presentations. The cult's first echelon all must know by now that their so-called disciplic succession is a hoax, but they remained convinced that they can pull it off. Which brings us to this month's presentation. About 45 days ago, your host speaker received an email from a friend who I had helped in editing of one of his publications. He shot me off a hyperlink of an interview loaded with historical revisionism by a non-American, his English heavily spiked with a foreign accent, disciple of some sort of one of the first echelon leaders of so-called ISKCON. It was conducted via what is called the GBCSPT channel, which is in some ways similar to a Zoom or a Skype hookup on the internet. It was the third installment of an ongoing multi-part series. The disciple, obviously a dedicated follower, was wearing tilak, such as not discernible on the forehead or the nose of the speaker. At least I could not make out any tilak on him. The title of this video is, Did the Zonal Acharyas Eclipse the GBC? It runs for just short of 17 minutes, over an hour. The well-known sannyasi being interviewed was, as it turns out, one of the zonal acharyas from back in the day. He can be belligerent in his verbal delivery, and he remains influential in so-called ISKCON. He is a very intelligent man, however, and can be quite convincing. My friend requested me as follows, quote, "I would love to hear your commentary on this video," unquote. Please understand that I never go out of my way to subject the astral quantum to listening to and or watching ISKCON regurgitate its interpretation of that cult's history. I avoid having to endure such psychic pollution, which I find disgusting. Yet the request was made, so I was forced to consider as to whether or not to fulfill it. I began to listen to the propaganda spouted by the former zonal. Most unpleasant. Flaws and deceit, along with rationalizations and misinterpretations, rang into my ears. The first time into it, I could only get through less than 1/4 of the session before I had to exit out. I chewed on the request. With significant hesitancy, I decided to take the challenge and fulfill the request. The commentator, the first echelon man, will be referred to either as the Swami or more specifically as Acharya Dev, which is not inappropriate. Many of you will know why, although I choose not to spell that out here at this time. The interviewer will be referred to as the interviewer. His questions will be quoted directly only once. Otherwise, they'll be entirely paraphrased. The responses of the Swami will also often be paraphrased, although he will be quoted verbatim regularly as well. I shall quote or paraphrase the Swami accurately, but I'm not going to go out of my way to meticulously regurgitate all of his historical revisionism. Next month, I shall treat the remaining topics covered in the hyperlink even more objectively than today, as those opinions and revisions from the second half of the tape are mostly well-worn illusions in the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. In the introductory phase of this hyperlink, the interviewer gushes over his opportunity to interview the Swami. This mood on his part is challenged as the interview proceeds, however. Indeed, the Swami later becomes quite vexed by how the interviewer presents a delayed question via a PowerPoint introductory set of photos. That section, by the way, is more than a bit cringeworthy. The interviewer is obviously adept at the medium, but the Swami wants this interview to be conducted to suit his points. This becomes crystal clear when they butt heads less than 1/2 into the presentation. However, previous to this, the interviewer shifts from a screen where you only see him, either glorifying the Swami or tossing out a softball, to a split screen or to a screen where the Swami is alone making his reply. There's a kind of amusingly annoying element to all of this. Indeed, at one point, the Swami playfully says to him, quote, "You don't have to keep disappearing," unquote. The interviewer describes the Swami by employing accolades, or what he considers to be accolades, during the introductory phase. One of them is a glorification of him as the man chosen to finish commenting on Srimad Bhagavatam, which consists of 12 cantos. He was not chosen by Prabhupada, however. Instead, he was chosen by the vitiated GBC in 1979. Most of you know that Prabhupada only completed purports up through the first few chapters of Canto 10 of the Bhagavad. The real history of how the Swami scored that commentary is not touched upon whatsoever. Indeed, it is likely that the interviewer now is not aware of it. But all of you should be aware of it. The Swami was not selected by Srila Prabhupada to complete the commentary. Another man, Pradyumna Prabhu, affectionately known by Prabhupada via his nickname Panditji, had actually been chosen. The vitiated GBC stole this seva from Pradyumna in the winter of 1979 and gave it to the Swami. It was taken away from Pradyumna for very dubious and ultimately unjustified reasons. It is a long story, and we cannot divert into all of that here. However, many years later, the GBC apologized to Pradyumna for how he was treated by the Commish and the Zonals in the late 70s. The Swami's capture of the commentary was facilitated under shady institutional circumstances. Returning to those various screens on the PowerPoint demonstration, there was a laughable and revealing moment when the interviewer apologizes to the Swami for keeping the split screen up while he, the Swami, is speaking. The Swami then forgives him, telling him that it's all right, as if such forgiveness is a demonstration of magnanimity on his part. In this way, the not-so-subtle control that the Swami holds over the interviewer is made apparent to any objective viewer. The interviewer then states, quote, "In July 1977, Srila Prabhupada selected 11 members of the GBC to begin acting at once as officiating gurus. Thus, the GBC understood Srila Prabhupada to have chosen the first initiating gurus to succeed him. After Srila Prabhupada's demise in November 1977, those 11 members quickly became elevated in an extraordinary way above all other devotees in the movement, including their colleagues in the GBC," unquote. Although technically the interviewer is reading an excerpt from Ravindra Sarup's position paper of 1994 entitled "Cleaning House and Cleaning Hearts," he is not at all in disagreement with it. It is integral to his PowerPoint presentation. The statement is loaded with defects, but these are not discussed because the interviewer does not see any of it as a flawed presentation of ISKCON history. Your host speaker clearly sees it as such. Converting officiating acharyas, who he calls officiating gurus, to initiating gurus is an obvious presupposition. It has no support anywhere from His Divine Grace, although he could have easily verified such a concept during the 5 months he remained physically manifest after the final appointment of Ritviks in 1977. In that excerpt that we quoted, they are called the first initiating gurus to succeed him, unquote. The quotation is also calling them successors, as you notice, as was Ravindra in the above-mentioned position paper that was being quoted. Regular gurus do not succeed the Sampradaya Acharya. They carry on the line, but only an Uttama Udhikari can ever be considered a true successor, capitalization on successor. Quote, "They were elevated in an extraordinary way," unquote. No, they weren't. They were elevated by vitiated GBC resolution. And there's nothing extraordinary about that, particularly since the whole scam was an imposition. The Swami makes no attempt to correct the presupposition, in no small part because it is integral to his historical revisionism. Virtually everybody in his cult believes it. the connective tissue between the appointment of Ritviks in July of 1977 and the cult empowerment of 11 men as so-called Mahabhagavats is either very weak or non-existent. There is no direct evidence of it. Prabhupada could have confirmed it at any time during his final months with us, but he did not. Over and above that, Prabhupada need not have appointed Ritviks at all. If those 11 men were gurus in July of 1977, he could have, and just as importantly, would have, recognized them as such. He didn't. Now, if you take recourse of what can be called, quote-unquote, the etiquette argument, guess again. His divine grace wanted his disciples to become initiating spiritual masters during his lifetime. This was verified beyond doubt by the following excerpt in a letter to Hangsaduta dated January 3rd, 1969, quote, I want that all of my spiritual sons and daughters will inherit this title of Bhaktivedanta, so that the family transcendental diploma will continue through the generations. Maybe by 1975, all of my disciples will be allowed to initiate and increase the numbers of the generations, unquote. A mere 9 days later, an almost identical excerpt was included in a letter to Kirtanananda. Prabhupada wanted his disciples to initiate while he was physically manifest. In point of fact, in the letter to Hangsaduta, he added, quote, that is my program, unquote. And he was still present in 1975, which solidifies this conclusion. The standard etiquette of the disciple not initiating while the guru is still physically manifest is overridden if the acharya decides to override it. In these excerpts, he indicated he wanted to do that. As such, if there were any regular gurus present in 1977, he could have and would have recognized them, and there would have been no reason or need to appoint Ritviks. He appointed Ritviks because that's the only material he had available to him at that time. Nowhere will you find Prabhupada officially recognizing anyone as a regular Diksha guru. There is nowhere to be found Prabhupada stating that the Ritviks he appointed in the summer of 1977 would automatically become initiating spiritual masters after he left the scene. That would have been the bare minimum requirement for legitimacy. Continuing now with the audio video, but still in the beginning stages of it, the Swami is asked about the Acharya board. After all, the title of the presentation requires that the status of the Acharya board would have to be discussed. He gets quite animated when answering this query. The gist of his answer is that the Acharya board had no power over the GBC and it did not make any decisions separate from it. However, this conclusion is belied by the facts. We find the following GBC resolution dated March 19, 1978, quote, Resolution number 16. The GBC will consider each year at Gaur Purnim the appointment of new spiritual masters to be approved by a 3/4 vote, unquote. And by the way, in that resolution, spiritual masters is capitalized. 2 days later, this resolution was completely overridden. On March 21st, 1978, we find the following GBC resolution, quote, a GBC committee will be formed consisting of GBC members who are initiating gurus. They will choose new gurus once per year in Mayapur. This is an amendment to resolution number 16 of March 19th, unquote. It was a short but comprehensive amendment because it changed resolution number 16. In effect, it replaced it with an entirely new method of selecting or appointing institutional gurus in so-called ISKCON. It amounted to nothing less than a 180. The acharya board now had all the power to appoint new gurus, and of course, for many years it refused to do so. Not difficult to figure out why it refused to do so, is it? How can so-called ISKCON get away with claiming that the acharya board was ineffectual and meaningless? In effect, this is the claim made by the Swami. Such a false claim is made today by that cult's leaders, including at least one who was on the acharya board himself, in order to minimize that egregious deviation of a special board created within the governing body. The seed of the idea was also, in 1978, planted by Swami B.R. Sridhar, when he opined that the non-guru section of the governing body can never question or judge its guru section. The Navadvip Mahant was responsible for planting the seed that the appointment of Ritviks meant the de facto future appointment of Diksha gurus, when he also opined, quote, Ritvik acharya, then it becomes as good as acharya. The then refers to Prabhupada's disappearance. Beyond the obvious fact that the members of the acharya board constituted a domineering voting bloc that was far more influential and powerful than all of the rest of the commissioners combined, the assertion that the acharya board was inconsequential is just more historical revisionism. In this case, it is being made by a first echelon representative of so-called ISKCON, as per the Swami, and over 4 decades after the fact. The amended resolution of March 21st, 1978 flies in the face of his false claim. The bottom line is that it was and is just another rationalization employed for damage control. In point of fact, the historical revisionism he engaged in during this session with an admirer contains myths, beginning with the myth that mere Ritviks automatically were to make a metamorphosis into initiating spiritual masters after the disappearance of Srila Prabhupada. And let us not forget that all 11 of those Ritviks, after pulling the wool over the eyes of practically the whole movement with an appointment that never was, took Mahabhagavat worship from high Vyasasans, which rivaled Prabhupada's in both height and opulence, throughout most of the movement's temple rooms. Ask yourself this question: would a regular guru do that? Would he take worship on such an elevated seat in front of installed, open deities? Once again, this is but more evidence that the appointment of Ritviks in July 1977 did not covertly amount to a delayed appointment of Diksha gurus 10 months later. Others have also noticed this. Tattvamasi. In the above-mentioned position paper of 1994, Ravindra Swarup objected to the Acharya board, and rightfully so. Ravindra may not have done so specifically in his more powerful position papers of the mid-80s, which in no small part led to the opulent pseudo-Vyasasans being removed from all of the temples. But in the mid-80s, he really did not have to. Ocean's 11 were cratering by that time, as 5 of those men were exposed to be engaged in illicit sexual connections with their disciples, 2 of the homosexual variety. Yet the Swami criticizes Ravindra Swarup for his correct perspective of the Acharya board, emphasizing that Ravindra was not present during the GBC meetings of that time. In particularly, the Swami brings up an ad hoc emergency meeting held in his house in Southern California in 1980. 3 of the pretender Mahabhagavats were, by that time, creating scandals. However, did the whole GBC body attend that emergency meeting? It is not made clear in this taped session under analysis, but that question may be justly raised. Previous to that, 2 of the new gurus took actions which revealed that they personally did not believe that they should be worshipped in the way prescribed by Swami B.R. Sridhar with his worn Bengali cliche, Mat Guru Si Jagaguru. That program, as we all now know, was rubber stamped by the vitiated GBC in 1978. The new guru of SoCal removed his Vyasasan from the LA Temple Room after he was dressed down and read the Riot Act by a senior female devotee. The new guru of Germany, while being worshipped on his so-called Vyasasan, hastily jumped down from it and fled to the privacy of his room, realizing just how offensive the whole pretense was. Yet, decades later, we are to believe based on the Swami's insistent and at times vituperative recollection that the Acharya board never had any power and the paper written by Ravindra was flawed because he did not attend any of the vitiated GBC meetings. The Swami's quote is as follows, quote, Ravindra Swarup Prabhu builds his case on something that was never put into practice. And in the case of choosing gurus and disciplining gurus, that was only done by the plenary GBC body, unquote. What does he mean when he throws in the adjective plenary in there? He goes on to insist the following about the amendment of March 21st, 1978, which empowered the Acharya board specifically to appoint gurus. Quote, it was never followed, unquote. Thus spake Acharya Dev. So what if it was not technically followed? He is making a mountain out of a molehill. It was formally resolved. And as aforementioned in practical terms, it played out de facto as a result. Why? Because those 11 men, especially in the late 70s, had at bare minimum at least 80% of the power of the governing body. Although technically, most of the GBC members at that time were not gurus, almost half of the body was a voting member of the Acharya board. Now, conveniently, over 4 decades later, we are to put stock into the Swami's assertion that the Acharya board had no actionable power? No sane, serious, and sincere transcendentalist will do so. Did the zonal acharyas eclipse the whole GBC body? Certainly. Unless you are gullible enough to buy into the Swami's spin. And let us not forget that he has a vested interest in promoting such historical revisionism, as the actual history will not look kindly upon him, especially since he was, like Swami B.R. Sridhar, behind the whole thing, despite today's rationalizations from him. Now, he made some denials about his worship as guru. So let us segue into those denials, that he ever wanted to be a quote-unquote big guru, as he describes it. His denial that he ever wanted to be opulently worshipped on a high seat and accorded a special zone, etc. These denials of his all hinge on the excuse that he was, in effect, forced by his god brothers to take all of that opulent worship from the high seat. Now, if he was a genuine guru, and a regular guru, by the way, is a genuine guru, who could have forced him to do anything? A guru decides what he's going to do, not others. Often embedded in ISKCON statements for public consumption is propaganda containing no shortage of diversions. That is certainly present in the session we are now analyzing. The chief issue here centers around why they pretended to be, in the term used by the Swami, quote-unquote, big gurus. He contends that all of his godbrothers, particularly at the temple president level, insisted that he act as such. Actually, I have practical experience that such was not the case. He even says in this hyperlink, he says that he's a friend of Balavanta. I was Balavanta's personal secretary, and Balavanta and I traveled down to the Miami temple, and the Swami was taking opulent worship inside the temple room. We didn't attend. And I know for a fact that Balavanta was against it as much as I was. In fact, possibly even more. So it's not a fact that all of his godbrothers were in favor of it. Just maybe some of his temple presidents were in favor of it. But consider these three quotes from the session we're now analyzing. Quote, I didn't feel qualified to do it, unquote. Quote, I don't think I'm ready for this. I don't think I'm ready to be a big guru, unquote. Quote, I would like to take a year to make some spiritual advancement, unquote. Now, in connection to Gaudiya Mutt laying in the weeds, waiting to strike, and the Swami's godbrothers insisting that he take the extreme step of the opulent worship on a high seat to prevent that, the Swami says, quote, from them, if you don't do this, we will be lost, unquote. Quote, if you don't, our movement is going to be destroyed in Latin America because of what the Gaudiya Mutt is doing, unquote. He is contending all of this now. Very convenient. But that abuse of power was actuated despite plenty of hints, events, proposed resolutions, and facts that it should never have transpired in the first place. When it really mattered, why didn't he act on his alleged conscience at that time? Very convenient now to say that he thought like this at that time, but his actions at that time did not demonstrate any of these sentiments to the devotees in general. He says now that he wanted to wait before doing it, but Swarup Damodar proposed just such a waiting period resolution in the 1978 GBC meeting. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Swami voted for that proposal. Or has all of this been conveniently obscured in order to lay down markers for damage control? It is more than a bit disconcerting that we are being asked to swallow all of this now. Over and above that, did what those 11 pretenders enact actually prevent what it was meant to prevent? Please let me emphasize this and speak again this sentence. Understand it clearly. Did what they do by taking that opulent worship on the high seats, when they did that, did it actually prevent what it was so-called meant to prevent? Did the zonal acharya scam actually erect an effective wall against Gaudiya Mutt influence? The answer must be a resounding no. Indeed, it was Gaudiya Mutt influence through the personality of Swami B.R. Sridhar that suggested the zonal concoction in the first place. And that's what the leaders of so-called ISKCON did, led by the 11 men who benefited the most from it. The leaders of so-called ISKCON consulted Swami B.R. Sridhar in the late 70s, and to a significantly lesser extent, they consulted Swami Narayan of Kesavaji Gaudiya Mutt in Mathura. For the record, Narayan Swami expressed deep skepticism of the high seats and opulent worship, but they did not heed his advice concerning that. Instead, they heeded the advice of the Navadvip Mahant, who told them that the faith of their disciples could never become strong unless they believed in the words of Swami B.R. Sridhar, Mat Guru si Jagat Guru. However, that was neither Prabhupada's teaching nor his essential instruction. Quote, when I order you become guru, he becomes regular guru. That's all, unquote. A regular guru is a Madhyam Adhikari previous to Raganuga. He is not entitled to imitate the Mahabhagavat. He instead is enjoined not to imitate. Why could not the GBC in 1978 have heeded the founder's directive? The movement would have held together much better than it did, even in the short term. Prabhupada's order contradicted that well-worn Bengali cliche of Mat Guru si Jagaguru. But Prabhupada was overridden and Swami B.R. Sridhar was accepted. This idea that the Swami had to imitate Mahabhagavat like the other 10 little Indian boys in order to prevent Gaudiya Mat influence does not ring true. Swami B.R. Sridhar said, quote, Ritvik acharya, then it becomes as good as acharya, unquote. They bought into that, in no small part because that was TKG's vision of the Ritviks from July 1977 onward. However, Swami B.R. Sridhar's seal of approval of that idea, based entirely upon a faulty presupposition, never supported by a statement from Prabhupada, proved beyond doubt that Gaudiya Mat influence was not only entering his movement at that time, but from March of 1978 until the great schism of the early 80s, Gaudiya Mat influence was controlling it. Imitation was also introduced by Gaudiya Mat in the form of the Navadvip Mahant. Quote, just put on the uniform and you will become the soldier, unquote. However, Prabhupada came down hard on imitation constantly in his writings. Gaudiya Mat influence was fully in the ascendant in so-called ISKCON in the late 70s. It was substantially responsible for ruining Prabhupada's branch of Lord Chaitanya's Tree of Devotion. The argument that the zonal acharya scam in all of its glory was the only way to prevent Gaudiya Mat from sinking the movement does not hold water. It is historical revisionism because the exact opposite is the truth. Then there's the Swami's weak rationalizations, utilizing the excuse that his godbrothers, particularly some temple presidents in his zone, in effect forced him to sit on a high seat and take opulent Uttama Adhikari worship from everyone in those temples. This included many, if not most, of his godbrothers and godsisters, and of course your host speaker is certainly exempted from that. There was no excuse for any of the 11, especially the Swami, indulging in that kind of egregious extravagance. None whatsoever. It did not accomplish its so-called intended goal. Instead, it created an atmosphere of fanaticism, opposition, and contentiousness. It degraded all who engaged in it. Those negative developments could also be seen very early on, and your host speaker saw all of them. And we must also remember that all 11 of those great pretenders were governing body commissioners. They enjoyed a great deal of power and many perks in that position. Did they pay the price for all of that? The price was that they were to guide the movement in the right way. Instead, they guided it straight into the crap hole. They took so many benefits, but they were also supposed to know what to do when Prabhupada departed. They were to take his advice, his directives, and his orders. They were present. From what I understand, all of them were present for that all-important meeting in his quarters in the last week of May 1977. That's when he said, quote, "Regular guru, that's all," unquote. Why did not at least one of them follow up and inquire as to what he meant by that term? Why did they all buy into the presupposition that a Ritvik acharya becomes a full-fledged Diksha guru when the founder leaves physical manifestation? Why was not Prabhupada consulted about all of this by at least one of them? Why did they buy into all of that very terrible advice from Swami B.R. Sridhar? Simply put, they didn't do the job. And that certainly includes the Swami. He was rumored to have a great deal of transcendental intelligence. By his own admission, he preferred to be a scholar rather than a guru. So why did he fall for all of the aforementioned nescience so easily? Why did he not protect the devotees of lesser intelligence? You cannot say that he was not warned. According to Henry Doktorsky in his book 11 Naked Emperors, he was warned very specifically, but went against those warnings. According to that book, Svarup Damodar Swami suggested that they all wait 5 years before acting as guru. Svarup Damodar offered this resolution during that fateful 1978 GBC meeting. It was voted down unanimously. According to another excerpt from the same book, the Swami was warned by Harikesh Swami, who rightly stated that Swami B.R. Sridhar had a history of being a muttbreaker, and that ISKCON should not risk consulting him. It was a great risk, and the movement was devastated after those headstrong men took it. Harikesh's resolution was also voted down unanimously. As such, the Swami, now insisting that his intentions were all good, that he did not want to do what he ended up doing, reminds us of that culminating scene in Quiz Show, where the senators are taking a statement from Van Doren as to why he went along with the whole pretense during his stint as a winning contestant on the game show called 21. Charles Van Doren had been fed the questions and answers in advance by the game show in order to keep him returning each week. He was popular with the viewing audience, and the network wanted those eyeballs for its advertisers. This was eventually exposed, and Congress convened a hearing on it. Van Doren gave a soul-searing apology to Congress, and it swayed all of the senators. As it turned out, all but one of them. 2 or 3 senators began praising Van Doren, a tenured teacher at Columbia, for the sincerity of his apology. Then came that hard-nosed senator who, after offering a line of faint praise to Van Doren, brought everyone back to the real issue. Van Doren had willingly cooperated with a cheating scheme that was meant to deceive the television viewing audience. The whole mood of the hearing changed, and the substantial audience attending the hearing also, it changed with them, and it changed dramatically. They all realized that the issue was not Van Doren's display of honest admission about what he had foolishly done. The real issue was the cheating that he had gone along with and had, both financially and in terms of American popularity, benefited from for many months as a result. The analogy of this specific scene from Quiz Show completely applies to how we should view the Swami's explanations of why and how he became a quote-unquote big guru. One with his own pranam mantra, with his own title, with the facility which he took to sit on opulent seats in temple rooms across the world in front of open installed deities. One with how he took worship from all the foolish newcomers as well as from his own god brothers and god sisters. And please note The Swami does not apologize for anything in this session under analysis. He gives his explanation of why and how the zonal acharya scam went down and how he is entangled in it, although allegedly he never wanted to be a part of it. It's all a diversion. He does not ask for forgiveness, but he palms it off on some of the other 11 in the following way, quote, "There were others of the 11 who were very ambitious. I know that. And there were others of the 11 who were ambitious and who imposed themselves even on their god brothers and god sisters who were uncomfortable, but forced it on them. This was the abuse that took place," unquote. Thus spake Acharya Dave. Dave, what are you doing, Dave? In the spring of 1978, the rank and file of the Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness, the branch of it founded by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada 12 years previously, underwent a massive subversion. The vast majority of its members were thrown into cognitive dissonance. The Swami was integral to that negative development. He did nothing of consequence to prevent it, and he directly participated as one of the 11 pretender zonal acharyas. In the second of this two-part series, we shall deconstruct the remaining last half of that Mayaka interview. In it, the Swami pulls out what appears to be a trump card from the bottom of his deck, but we shall show what that canard really is. Nothing but a joker. Wait for it. Sadeva Samya.